The date was May 28th, 1944. Just 9 days before the largest amphibious invasion in human history would change the course of World War II forever. But on a rain-soaked tank depot outside Southampton, England, nobody was thinking about glory or victory. They were thinking about death. Sergeant Curtis Cullen Jr. stood knee-deep in mud, staring at the mechanical graveyard around him. Hundreds of M4 Sherman tanks sat idle, their engines silent, their crews restless. These weren't broken machines waiting for repair. These were death traps waiting to fulfill their purpose. Curtis wiped the rain from his face and looked down at the crumpled intelligence report in his hands. The paper was already dissolving in the downpour, but he'd read it so many times he could recite it from memory. The words haunted him. Bocage, terrain, impenetrable hedgerows, tank, advancement, impossible, casualties, extreme. The bocage. Even the words sounded sinister. For 3 weeks, Allied Command had been receiving increasingly desperate reports from reconnaissance teams in Normandy. The French countryside they were about to invade wasn't the open farmland shown in their maps and briefings. It was something far worse. Something that would turn their technological superiority into a suicide mission. The hedgerows of Normandy had been growing for over 1,000 years. Ancient farmers had planted them as property boundaries, piling earth and stone into massive walls, then planting dense thickets of trees, bushes, and brambles on top. Over centuries, the roots had grown so thick and tangled, they were harder than concrete. These natural fortifications stood 12 to 15 feet high and stretched for miles in every direction, creating a maze of small fields separated by impenetrable walls. And the Germans knew it. They'd had 4 years to perfect their defense. Curtis had seen the reconnaissance photos. He'd listened to the British officers who'd fought in similar terrain during training exercises. Their words echoed in his mind. A Sherman can't punch through. It tries to climb, exposes its soft underbelly, and then? They didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone knew what a German Panzerfaust rocket did to an exposed tank belly. The math was simple and horrifying. Every hedgerow was a killing field. Every field was a cage. The Sherman would approach a hedgerow, try to climb it, tilt upward at a 45-degree angle, expose its vulnerable underside, and present a perfect target. One German soldier with a rocket launcher could destroy a 70,000-pound tank and kill 5 men in seconds. And there were thousands of hedgerows between the beaches and Berlin. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison had gathered the tank commanders that morning for a briefing that felt more like a funeral. He was a hard man, weathered by North Africa and Sicily. But even his voice had cracked when he delivered the projections. "Gentlemen, intelligence estimates we'll lose 60% of our armor in the first week. Not from German tanks, not from artillery, from hedgerows." He paused, letting that sink in. "We're sending you into a meat grinder, and we don't have a solution." The room had erupted. Experienced tank commanders who'd survived Kasserine Pass and Anzio were shouting, demanding answers. How could they send thousands of men to die against bushes? Where were the engineers? Where was the equipment? Why hadn't anyone thought of this? Morrison had no answers. Nobody did. The invasion was in 9 days. The decision had been made at the highest levels. They would land, they would advance, and they would accept the casualties. It was war. Men died. But Curtis Cullen wasn't a man who accepted no solution. He was a cavalry sergeant from New York, just 29 years old, with grease under his fingernails and a mechanical mind that never stopped working. While other soldiers drank away their pre-invasion jitters, Curtis spent his nights in the motor pool, thinking, sketching, calculating. The problem consumed him. How do you make a tank push through something that's been growing for 1,000 years? You can't go over it. You can't go around it. So you have to go through it. That night, as thunder rolled across the English Channel and lightning illuminated the rows of waiting Shermans, Curtis sat alone in a maintenance shed with a welding torch, a piece of scrap metal, and an idea that everyone said was crazy. He thought about medieval battering rams. He thought about plows cutting through frozen earth. He thought about every machine he'd ever fixed. every problem he'd ever solved. And then he thought about the German beach obstacles. 3 days earlier, he'd seen samples brought back from reconnaissance raids. The Germans had welded massive steel hedgehogs and Czech hedgehogs all along the beaches, designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. They looked like giant jacks made of railroad steel, each angle sharpened to a point. Curtis stared at a piece of that captured German steel, still crusted with sand and rust from the Atlantic. And suddenly, he knew. If German steel could stop Allied ships, why couldn't Allied steel cut through German hedgerows? He fired up the welding torch. The blue flame cast dancing shadows across the walls as he began to cut and shape the metal. Sparks flew like fireflies in the darkness. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, Curtis Cullen was building something that would change the course of history. He worked through the night, welding thick steel prongs onto a metal frame. The design was brutally simple. 6 heavy steel teeth, angled forward and down, that would be welded to the front of a Sherman tank. The teeth would bite into the base of a hedgerow, while the tank's weight and power drove forward, cutting through the roots like a hot knife through butter. By dawn, Curtis had created the first prototype. It looked crude, almost ridiculous. Just chunks of German beach obstacles welded into a metal fork and attached to the front of a Sherman. But when he climbed into the tank at first light and drove it straight at a test embankment, something miraculous happened. The teeth bit deep. The engine roared. The tank lurched forward. And the 1,000-year-old hedgerow, the impenetrable barrier that was supposed to destroy the entire invasion, split apart like paper. Curtis sat in the driver's seat, hands shaking, barely believing what he'd just done. He'd just saved D-Day. He just didn't know it yet. Curtis Cullen had exactly 8 days to do the impossible. Word of his successful test spread through the tank depot like wildfire. By mid-morning on May 29th, every tank commander within 50 miles wanted to see the device that could cut through hedgerows. They came in jeeps and on foot, skeptical and desperate in equal measure. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison arrived at the motor pool to find a crowd of officers surrounding Curtis's Sherman. The crude steel teeth jutting from its front looked like something a farmer might cobble together, not like military equipment that would save thousands of lives. "Demonstrate it again," Morrison ordered, his voice tight with barely contained hope. Curtis climbed into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life. He aimed the tank at the thickest part of the test embankment, a section they'd reinforced with logs and stones to simulate a 1,000-year-old Norman hedgerow. The crowd fell silent. The Sherman lurched forward. The steel teeth bit into the earth and root mass. For a moment, nothing happened. The engine screamed. The tracks churned mud. Then, with a sound like the earth itself splitting open, the hedgerow gave way. The Sherman burst through to the other side, its hull level, its belly protected, its guns still pointed forward at the enemy. Morrison's hand was already reaching for his radio before the tank came to a stop. "Get me General Bradley." Now, what happened next would become one of the most extraordinary feats of military logistics in World War II, though it would remain classified for years after the war ended. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 1st U.S. Army, grasped the implications immediately. If Cullen's device worked in combat, it would transform the Normandy invasion from a predicted bloodbath into a fighting chance. But there was a problem that made even the hardened general's stomach turn. They needed thousands of these devices. The numbers were staggering. The invasion force included over 2,000 Sherman tanks. Even if they couldn't equip them all, they needed enough to ensure every armored unit had at least 3 hedgebreakers to lead the way. That meant building at least 500 devices, possibly 1,000, in 8 days, with materials they didn't have, using workshops that were already working 24-hour shifts. And they couldn't tell anyone why. The invasion date was the most closely guarded secret in military history. Even hinting that they needed specialized equipment for Norman hedgerows could tip off German intelligence about where and when the Allies would strike. Bradley made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed if it had failed. He authorized the cannibalization of German beach obstacles. Those same steel hedgehogs that the Germans had spent months installing along the Atlantic Wall, designed to destroy Allied landing craft, would become the raw material for the device that would destroy Germany's hedgerow defense. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Engineers from the Royal Navy were diverted from their duties and sworn to absolute secrecy. Under cover of darkness, ships began making runs to the French coast, not to scout invasion beaches, but to steal German steel. Commandos who should have been resting before D-Day instead found themselves cutting apart beach obstacles with torches and hauling tons of steel back to England. It was insane. It was dangerous. It was the only option. Back at the depot, Curtis Cullen became the most important sergeant in the Allied Army, though he'd never receive a promotion for it. Every motor pool, every maintenance facility, every workshop within 100 miles was quietly redirected to a single task: build the hedge breakers. But they couldn't call them that. Security protocols meant they were referred to only as Cullen devices, or more cryptically, rhino attachments. Curtis spent 18-hour days racing from facility to facility, teaching welders and mechanics how to construct the devices. He'd sketch the design on scraps of paper, demonstrate the critical angles, explain why each tooth had to be positioned exactly right. "If the angle's too steep, you'll ride up over the hedgerow," he'd explain, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and smoke. "Too shallow, and you'll just push dirt. It has to be exactly 45 degrees, and the welds have to be perfect. 5 men are going to trust their lives to your welding. Make it count." The welders worked in shifts around the clock. The sound of welding torches never stopped. Sparks flew day and night. The acrid smell of hot metal and welding flux became so thick it coated the inside of your lungs. But as June 1st became June 2nd, then June 3rd, it became clear they weren't going to make it. The mathematics were brutal. Each device took 4 hours to construct if everything went perfectly. They never did. Welds cracked, steel warped. Measurements were off by fractions of inches that made the difference between life and death. They'd completed maybe 200 devices. They needed at least 500. The invasion was in 3 days. That's when Curtis came up with his second brilliant innovation. "We don't need to attach them all before boarding," he told Morrison. "We teach the tank crews how to weld them on themselves. Once we secure the beaches, they can attach them in France." It was risky. Tank crews weren't welders. They'd be working under fire, in combat conditions, with German artillery and snipers trying to kill them. But it was the only way. On June 4th, with just 2 days before the invasion, Curtis held emergency welding classes. Hundreds of tank commanders crowded into workshops, learning skills that usually took months to master. They practiced on scrap metal, their hands clumsy with the unfamiliar torches, their eyes watering from the bright flames. "You're not building a cathedral," Curtis told them. "You're building something that has to work once, for 20 minutes, while you push through a hedgerow. Make it strong. Make it fast. And for God's sake, don't blow yourself up with the torch." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd, but everyone understood the stakes. Meanwhile, the completed rhino attachments were being distributed to select tanks. The doctrine was simple. 3 equipped Shermans per company would lead the way, breaking through hedgerows to create gaps for the rest of the armor to follow. But nobody knew if it would actually work in combat. The test embankment in England was one thing. A fortified German position behind a Norman hedgerow, with machine guns and Panzerfausts and artillery, was something else entirely. On the evening of June 5th, Curtis Cullen stood on the Southampton docks, watching Sherman tanks roll onto landing craft. About 300 were now equipped with his device. Another 500 kits, unassembled, were being loaded as cargo. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was what they had. A young tank commander, couldn't have been more than 20 years old, approached Curtis. His name was Lieutenant James Foster, and his Sherman was one of the first to receive the rhino attachment. "Sergeant Cullen," Foster said, his voice shaking slightly, "I just wanted to say thank you for giving us a chance." Curtis looked at the kid's face, saw the fear barely hidden behind the brave facade, and felt the weight of what he'd created. Hundreds of men were about to storm into hell, trusting that his welding would save them. "Just come back," Curtis said quietly. "All of you, come back and tell me it worked." As darkness fell, the greatest armada in history began to move. 5,000 ships, carrying 150,000 men, sailed into the English Channel. Among them were hundreds of Sherman tanks, some with crude steel teeth welded to their fronts, heading toward the beaches of Normandy. Curtis Cullen wouldn't be with them. His job was done. He'd have to wait with the rest of the world to learn if his invention would save lives, or if the men who trusted it would die screaming in burning tanks. That night, as the invasion fleet disappeared into the darkness, Curtis sat alone in an empty workshop, surrounded by scrap metal and cold welding torches, and prayed. Tomorrow was D-Day, and everything depended on whether a sergeant's welding could break through 1,000 years of French agriculture. The morning of June 6th, 1944, began with thunder. But it wasn't a storm. It was thousands of naval guns pounding the coast of Normandy, trying to soften the German defenses before the largest amphibious invasion in history hit the beaches. Lieutenant James Foster sat in the driver's compartment of his Sherman tank, wedged inside a landing craft that pitched and rolled in the violent surf. Around him he could hear men vomiting, praying, crying. The sound of naval bombardment was so loud it felt like the world was ending. He looked forward at the steel teeth welded to his tank's front. Sergeant Cullen's invention. His lifeline. Or his tombstone. 30 seconds! Someone screamed over the chaos. The ramp dropped. Gray water and gray sky and gray death filled Foster's vision. Sherman tanks weren't designed to swim, but they had to try. Waterproofing, flotation devices, prayers, all of it together might keep the 70,000-pound machine from sinking to the bottom of the English Channel. Foster's tank rolled off the ramp and dropped. For a terrifying moment, everything was underwater. Then, miraculously, the tank bobbed up, its engine sputtering but alive. Through his narrow viewport, Foster could see Omaha Beach through the smoke and chaos. It looked like hell had opened its mouth. The landing at Omaha was already a disaster. Bodies floated in the surf. Burning vehicles littered the beach. Machine gun fire tore through the air like invisible scythes. But Foster had his orders. Get off the beach, get inland, find a hedgerow, and test the device. If he lived that long, it took 2 hours of pure chaos to get his Sherman off the beach and into the coastal fields. 2 hours of dodging artillery, pushing through wire, watching other tanks burn. By the time Foster's platoon reached the first hedgerow a mile inland, he'd lost 3 tanks and 15 men. The hedgerow loomed before them, exactly as brutal as the reconnaissance photos had shown. 12 feet of ancient earth, stone, and root, topped with dense brambles. Behind it, German voices shouted commands. They were waiting. Foster's radio crackled. "Rhino 1, this is command. You are authorized to test the device. All units watching. Make it count." No pressure, Foster thought bitterly. Just the entire invasion depending on whether some sergeant's welding holds up. "Driver, forward," Foster commanded. "Full speed." The Sherman's engine roared. The tank accelerated toward the hedgerow. Foster could hear German machine guns opening fire. Bullets pinging off the armor like deadly rain. 50 yards. 40. 30. Brace for impact. The steel teeth hit the hedgerow at 20 miles per hour. For one terrible second, nothing happened. The tank shuddered. The engine screamed. The tracks churned earth. Foster's heart stopped as he imagined the whole thing failing, the tank tilting up, exposing its belly to German rockets. Then, with a sound like a tree being ripped from the earth, the hedgerow began to give way. The steel prongs bit deep into the root mass. The Sherman's 30 tons of weight and 400 horsepower drove forward like a mechanical avalanche. Ancient roots, thicker than a man's arm, snapped like twigs. Earth and stone that had stood for centuries crumbled. The Sherman burst through to the other side. Foster's viewport suddenly filled with green field and blue sky instead of brown hedge. His tank was level. His guns were pointed forward. He was through. "Holy Mother of God," his gunner whispered. It worked. It actually worked. But there was no time to celebrate. They'd broken through into a field where 3 German soldiers were setting up an anti-tank gun. Foster's gunner didn't hesitate. The Sherman's cannon spoke once. The German position exploded. Behind Foster, 2 more Rhino-equipped Shermans crashed through the gaps he'd created. Within minutes, what should have been a killing ground became an Allied breakthrough. The radio exploded with chatter. Every unit within range wanted to know what happened. How did they get through? Can they do it again? Can we get more of those devices? Foster keyed his mic, his voice shaking with adrenaline and relief. "Command, Rhino 1. The device is successful. Repeat, device is successful. We are through the hedgerow with minimal damage. We are advancing." Back in England, Curtis Coolin heard the news third hand. Hours later, when an officer burst into the motor pool shouting that the Rhino tanks were cutting through the bocage like butter, Curtis sat down heavily on a workbench, his legs suddenly unable to support him. It worked. His crazy idea, his midnight welding, his impossible device, it had worked in actual combat. But the battle was far from over. For the next 6 weeks, the Battle of Normandy became a brutal war of attrition. The Rhino device proved its worth again and again. But there weren't enough of them. Tank crews without the attachments still had to attempt the hedgerows the old way, and the casualties were exactly as horrific as predicted. General Bradley issued emergency orders. Every available welder, every motor pool, every maintenance crew in the beachhead was to drop everything and manufacture more Rhino devices. The German beach obstacles that the Allies had captured became a twisted supply chain steel that Germany installed to stop the invasion was being cut apart and welded onto Allied tanks. Tank crews became expert welders by necessity. Between battles, exhausted soldiers who should have been resting instead spent hours with welding torches, attaching the crude steel teeth to their Shermans. It was hot, dangerous work done under artillery fire and sniper harassment, but it saved lives. By mid-July, virtually every Sherman tank in Normandy had some version of the Rhino attachment. The modifications varied. Some crews added extra teeth, others reinforced the frames, some painted them to look more intimidating. But the basic design remained Sergeant Cullen's brilliant simplicity: angled steel prongs that bit into ancient roots and tore them apart. The German military was baffled. Their intelligence reports described Allied tanks somehow plowing through bocage that should have been impassable. They couldn't figure out how it was being done. Some German commanders thought the Americans had developed a new type of tank. Others believed it was some kind of secret weapon. It was just welding. Brilliant, simple welding. By August, when the Allies finally broke out of Normandy and began their rapid advance across France, military historians were already calling the Rhino device one of the most important tactical innovations of the war. Without it, the invasion might have bogged down for months, giving Germany time to reinforce and potentially push the Allies back into the sea. A young war correspondent named Andy Rooney, who would later become famous, wrote about watching Rhino-equipped Shermans in action. They go at those hedgerows like angry bulls, and the ancient walls of France that have stood since medieval times just crumble away. It's the most beautiful, ugly thing I've ever seen. Lieutenant Foster survived the war. So did his Sherman, now covered in crude welded patches where German rounds had tested Cullen's welding. Foster kept a piece of the original Rhino attachment, a single steel tooth cut from the device that had saved his life dozens of times. Years later, he would say, "Every man in my crew owed his life to a sergeant we never met, who stayed up one night welding scrap metal while we were scared out of our minds on a boat heading to France." That's war. Sometimes the heroes never fire a shot. But as the war continued and the headlines focused on generals and battles and grand strategy, Sergeant Curtis Cullen's name began to fade from the official records. The device was working so well that it became unremarkable, just another piece of standard equipment. And that's when something shocking happened. something that almost erased Curtis Cullen from history entirely. The date was September 15th, 1944. The war in Europe was far from over, but the Normandy campaign was complete. Allied forces were racing toward Germany. And in a headquarters tent in liberated France, a bureaucratic nightmare was unfolding that would almost erase Curtis Cullen from history. A British liaison officer named Captain Edmund Thornton was reviewing equipment reports when he noticed something odd. Hundreds of after-action reports mentioned rhino devices or hedgerow cutters, but none of them credited an inventor. As far as the paperwork was concerned, the devices had simply appeared, like manna from heaven. Thornton, a meticulous man who believed proper documentation was the foundation of civilization, decided to investigate. What he discovered shocked him. There was no official patent, no documented inventor, no record of approval from the engineering corps. As far as military bureaucracy was concerned, the single most important tactical innovation of the Normandy invasion didn't officially exist. How was this possible? The answer lay in the chaos and secrecy surrounding D-Day. In the desperate rush to produce the devices before the invasion, nobody had bothered with paperwork. Curtis Cullen had invented it, Bradley had authorized it, and hundreds of welders had built it, all under strict security protocols that prioritized speed over documentation. Now, 3 months later, with thousands of rhino attachments in use and the device credited with saving potentially 10,000 lives, nobody could officially say who invented it. Worse, other people were starting to take credit. A colonel in the engineering corps claimed he'd designed the basic concept. A British officer said he'd suggested using German beach obstacles as raw materials. An ordnance company in Ohio was filing patents for a similar device, claiming independent invention. The man who'd actually created the rhino in a late-night welding session was a sergeant from New York who'd returned to routine duties, too busy maintaining tanks to worry about credit. Captain Thornton, horrified by this injustice, began a personal mission to set the record straight. He interviewed dozens of witnesses, tank commanders who'd been at the original demonstration, welders who'd learned the technique from Curtis personally, even Lieutenant Colonel Morrison. The testimony was unanimous. Curtis G. Cullen Jr., a cavalry sergeant, had invented the device entirely on his own initiative, with no official support or funding, driven by nothing more than the knowledge that men were going to die without it. Thornton compiled a report and sent it up the chain of command, demanding that Curtis receive proper recognition. And that's when things got complicated. The U.S. military had a problem. If they officially credited Curtis with inventing the rhino device, they'd have to explain why a sergeant had access to classified intelligence reports about the bocage, why he'd been allowed to waste military resources on unauthorized experiments, and why a critical piece of invasion equipment had been developed completely outside normal channels. It made everyone look incompetent. The generals and colonels who should have solved the hedgerow problem had failed. A low-ranking sergeant had succeeded. This was embarrassing at best and career-ending at worst for the officers who'd missed something so obvious. There were serious discussions about simply burying the whole thing. The rhino device worked, the invasion succeeded. Why stir up trouble with awkward questions about credit and oversight? But Captain Thornton refused to let it go. He wrote letters to newspapers. He contacted members of Congress. He made enough noise that the military finally had to respond. On March 15th, 1945, in a ceremony that the Army clearly hoped would be quiet and quick, Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen Jr. was awarded the Legion of Merit for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services. The citation was deliberately vague, mentioning the development of a mechanical device without specifying what it did or why it mattered. Curtis received his medal from a general who mispronounced his name in a ceremony attended by maybe 30 people, most of whom had no idea what they were witnessing. No press was invited, no cameras recorded it. The man who'd arguably saved the D-Day invasion received less public recognition than lieutenants who'd captured small villages. Curtis didn't seem to mind. When asked about it later, he simply said, "I was just trying to keep my buddies alive." That's what you do in war. But the story doesn't end there. Over the decades that followed, Curtis Cullen's name appeared sporadically in military histories. usually in footnotes. Some books got his first name wrong. Others credited the invention to a committee. By the 1960 seconds, when the first major histories of D-Day were being written, the Rhino device was mentioned as important, but its inventor had become uncertain. Developed by American tank crews in the field. One history book vaguely stated, invented by unknown GIs, claimed another. Curtis didn't fight it. He returned to civilian life, worked as a truck driver, raised a family, and rarely talked about the war. When his kids asked him what he did in World War II, he'd say, "I fixed tanks mostly, kept them running." It wasn't until 1989, when historian Stephen Ambrose was researching his book about D-Day, that someone finally tracked down the full story. Ambrose found Curtis living in a modest house in Queens, New York, 84 years old, and mostly forgotten by history. "Did you really invent the Rhino device?" Ambrose asked. Curtis, by then nearly deaf and suffering from arthritis, thought for a long moment. "Yeah," he finally said. "I welded some steel to a tank. Seemed like it might work." "Mr. Cullen," Ambrose said gently, "military analysts estimate your invention saved between 5,000 and 10,000 American lives, possibly more. You may have saved the entire Normandy invasion from failing." Curtis was quiet for a while. Then he said something that Ambrose would include in his book, words that perfectly captured the strange heroism of war. "I just didn't want my friends to die, because nobody figured out how to deal with some bushes. Seems stupid. Still does." Curtis G. Cullen Jr. died in 1963, largely unknown outside his neighborhood. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his military service in one sentence. It did not mention the Rhino device. It did not mention that historians would later call his invention one of the 50 most important innovations of World War II. But here's the remarkable thing. His device is still studied in military academies today. It's taught as a perfect example of battlefield innovation, of how a single soldier with initiative and practical skills can change the course of history. Modern engineers have analyzed Curtis's design and concluded it was nearly perfect for its purpose. The angles, the weight distribution, the simplicity that allowed mass production. Everything was exactly right. It's the kind of design that looks obvious in hindsight but required genuine brilliance to envision. And every June 6th, in military museums around the world, Sherman tanks equipped with crude steel teeth stand as monuments to the men who fought in Normandy. Most visitors walk past them without understanding what they're looking at. Those teeth are the legacy of a sergeant from New York who stayed up one night welding scrap metal because he knew there had to be a better way. The Germans built the Atlantic Wall. They fortified the beaches. They mined the fields. They created elaborate defense in depth. But they never anticipated Curtis Cullen, working alone in a motor pool, turning their own steel against them. One man, one night, one idea. Thousands of lives saved. That's the real story of D-Day that history almost forgot. The next time you hear about the Normandy invasion, remember, sometimes the most important heroes aren't the ones leading the charge or making the grand strategies. Sometimes they're sergeants with welding torches, working alone in the rain, refusing to accept that good men should die because nobody bothered to solve a solvable problem. Curtis G. Cullen Jr. saved D-Day, and hardly anyone knows his name.